Okay. The topic for today's lecture is prep time strategies and content generation. So there are two parts to that. Prep time strategies is what you're doing in those like 15, 20 minutes of prep time. So exactly how you should be spending your time, how you should be discussing things with your partner, things like that. And then content generation is about the best way to think up of new arguments, kind of the thought process you want to go through in order to have a reliable system of creating arguments. So, so there are three main sections that come under prep time. The biggest section right at the bottom, the most obvious one, is content generation. So we've talked about this. This is coming up with those headline arguments, things like, okay, someone's going to lose weight, or this is going to benefit the environment, these kinds of broader topics which you know you want to discuss in the debate. And so these are the first things that come to mind when you start prepping. And this is what you build everything else in your prep time off of. The next thing that comes here is valuing your argumentation. So what this means is discussing what we've thought up of. Is it a good argument? Is it something that's not that valuable and we should discard it? Or is it something that maybe we disagree on and so it needs more discussion between the two of us in order to really figure out is it worthwhile or not? And the importance of valuing argumentation is to make sure that you have your arguments in an order of priority. You want to be getting out your best and most important arguments as quickly as possible, as early on within your speech as possible. And you want to leave the less important, smaller points to the end. Because imagine you're giving your speech and then you run out of time and then you're like, oh my God, my best argument was last and so I didn't get to say it. You don't want that kind of situation to occur, especially if it's just something as like logistically problematic, such as you put your best argument at the end of your sheet of paper, and so by the time you got to it, you didn't have enough time to actually say it properly. And so, if you value your arguments properly, you'll be able to say the strongest argument first. You'll be able to have a really strong case overall, and to the judge, they'll also see more structure within your speech. Finally, you have your analysis. So we've talked a lot about this yesterday and in previous lectures, but this is really the meaty content of your speech. These are the reasons why your arguments are true, but it also, in this situation, applies to things like examples, illustrations, impacts. And so it's basically the core of what debating really is, and it's the most important part, of course, but it has to come after you've done your content generation and after you've evaluated your arguments. So there's an order to these things. You want to come up with your headlines, make sure you know which is more important, and then you start working on developing each argument based on that order of priority. Does that make sense to everyone? Uh, any questions? I'll wait 5 or 10 seconds. Okay. So moving on to what you actually want to be doing with your 15 minutes of time. First, I'll go over the opening teams. So opening government and opening opposition. These are the teams who are going to be speaking first within the span of the debate. Now, there are three like categories that you should kind of split your prep time into. The first one is called silent preparation. This is probably something you have not heard of yet, and most likely you haven't been doing in your debates because it's not the most obvious thing to be doing. It's not that intuitive. But what this really means is that you spend 2 minutes thinking up of arguments by yourself. So you don't talk to your partner, you don't discuss things with them because you don't want to bias them, you don't want to get too caught up in their way of thinking. And there are a lot of other benefits that also come from thinking of a motion by yourself. So the main thing is, what if you get a really difficult motion? You want to have these like 2 minutes to kind of get your head around the motion, really understand, okay, how am I going to deal with this? Try not to panic, things along those lines. So the first like useful factor of this is just making sure you have a strong start to your prep time and that you aren't too bogged down by a difficult motion. Second, and probably even more important, is that you and your partner are going to be thinking up of a more varied like amount of arguments if you think of them by yourself. So, of course, two heads are better than one, and if you start discussing things with each other as soon as prep time starts, then almost certainly you're just going to agree with what the other person says, and your mind is going to be quite kind of narrow in its thinking. So the first like kind of area of argumentation that your partner initially thinks up of, your mind is going to try developing on that instead of thinking of a different like uh kind of pillar of thought which you could have been exploring instead. And so if you're able to have these 2 minutes thinking by yourself, you're going to have more varied arguments when you come together. And that's where you come to the discussion section. So from approximately 2 minutes to 7 minutes of your prep time, this is where you start talking to your partner, you discuss what you've thought up of during your silent preparation, and you think up of which arguments are the best ones, the things along those lines. And this is also the area where you start evaluating your arguments. So you want to know who is going to run which argument. It's not just a matter of if I thought up of an argument, I should be the one to say it. You should be explaining your arguments to your partner so that they can understand it just as well as you do. And if needed, they should be able to deliver that argument instead of you being the one who does that. And this is very important because, as I've said before, prioritizing your arguments is essential. And so if you think up of a very strong argument, but you're the second speaker, the best thing to do is to make sure that the first speaker understands the argument really well and that they are the ones to deliver it, because that's going to make your case and your two speeches as a whole a lot stronger. So there are a few situations which can occur here when you're thinking up of arguments and when you discuss them with each other. The first is that you both think up of the same argument. Maybe it's just the like strongest argument for the motion, and it's the one that comes to your mind straight away. And so you're like, okay, great. We'll definitely do that one. Let's go on to the other arguments and leave that one for later. The second situation might be that you've thought up of an argument which your partner hasn't. That's where you need to explain your argument to your partner. They try poking holes in it, and if by the end of your like short discussion you think it's still a really good strong point, then you keep it and you develop on it later. If your partner pokes too many holes in it and you realize, oh wait, maybe it's not as strong of a point as I originally thought, then you discard it and move on and don't worry about it too much. Thirdly, is if you disagree with your partner, and this happens all the time, that you think up of a point and your partner just fundamentally disagrees with the point of whether it's a good point or not. And once again, it all just comes down to discussion. If you talk things through with your partner, you'll come to an agreement as to whether you should run the point or not. And it's a very similar process. You just do a kind of mini debate, and by the end of it, you'll both realize if it's a good point or not. And so you assign your arguments to each other based on who's first speaker, who's second speaker, things along those lines. And then finally, you move on to mechanization and development of material. So this is from approximately minutes 7 through 13, and this leaves approximately 2 minutes for you to have some buffer time or maybe have some more personalized prep time where you just allocate those 2 minutes into either of these three sections, however you feel is works best for you. And so on this third section, this is the meaty content. So you've thought up of what arguments you're going to run, and each person knows what arguments they're going to say. And so you start developing on them. You already have the claim or the headline, which we talked about yesterday. That's what you've finished up. And now you focus on things like analysis, impacting, weighing, and sorry, and below each of the points that you've written down, you start adding these details. So going more into what these details actually look like. So analysis is the reasoning as to why your arguments are true. Uh, Something called asymmetry is a term basically explaining why something which is beneficial on your side of the motion isn't beneficial on the other person's side. And so you're trying to say that your benefits are unique and that only you are able to provide them. Because if the opposition is able to say that they have the same benefits, then it's not a very important point because it doesn't really matter what the motion is. Both sides will have that benefit. And moving on to impacting, we've explained this before as well. These are kind of the consequences of your argument, uh, what, why your argument is so important, things along those lines. And then finally, weighing is explaining why your argument is more important than an opposition's argument. And of course, you're still in prep time right now, so you don't know what the opposition is going to say, but you can still think about weighing. You can think about the different parts of your argument, which are most likely going to be factors in making it better than any other argument which is brought out. So those are the main things. That's what speaker one is doing, but speaker two is most likely going to be doing the same things, considering they probably have a unique argument of their own, which speaker one is not going to talk about. But also, speaker two should be trying to preempt the opposition's arguments. And what this really means is either basically guessing or predicting what the opposition is going to say. So in a lot of motions, it's not too difficult to at least think of one argument which the opposition is probably going to say. Usually it's just the most straightforward one. And if you can kind of figure out the opposition's thought process, then you can already decide how you're going to respond to it before the debate has even begun. And considering speaker two will have more rebuttal in their speech, having this kind of preemptive argumentation is going to be quite useful instead of having to think of everything on the spot while your opposition is giving their speech. So yeah, that's the main thing. You want to be trying to preempt and rebut the opposition even before the debate has begun. Does that all make sense? That's quite a lot of information. Okay, so moving on to the closing teams, you can probably see the first three kind of like sections here are basically the same as what opening teams are doing. And that's quite obvious, right? Like closing teams also need to be thinking of arguments, they need to be discussing with their partner, and they need to be developing the arguments that they've thought up of. The main thing that I would say is as a closing team, it's quite possible that your arguments are going to get taken up by the opening teams. And so they'll say a point that you wanted to say. And so because that's quite possible, you do want to be focusing a bit more on the breadth of your arguments. So think of niche arguments which most likely won't come up. And so you can be confident in the fact that you'll have at least a couple niche arguments to say, even if the most obvious ones have already been talked about. So focus a bit more on the breadth of arguments, maybe have like one or two more arguments than you would if you were a opening team. But other than that, it's mainly the same. The key difference is this fourth section, which is during the debate, as a closing team, you actually have quite a significant amount of time. So if you imagine the opening government, prime minister, they get exactly 15 minutes, and then they start their speech right after that. So they get almost no time to actually think through things. But as a closing team, you actually get a lot of time. You have your 15 minutes of prep time, and then you have around 4 or maybe even 5 speeches before it's your turn to speak. And so what this means is that you want to be making use of that time as well. What this looks like is re-evaluating the arguments you've thought up of during prep time. So maybe the debate's not necessarily going the way you thought it might, and you need to kind of reconsider your case, or there are things which the opposition has said during their early speeches, which weakens the arguments that you've thought up of, just like preemptively weakens them. And so you want to be strengthening those arguments uh, in order to overcome that. And even if they haven't been weakened, of course, since you have this extra time, you want to be thinking of more analysis, more impacts, really getting more depth into those arguments. And then finally, you want to be coming up with areas of clash which the debate is revolving around. What a clash point means is basically a really key like point in the debate which both proposition and opposition teams are trying to contest. So it might be something like, will obesity rates actually go down or not? Maybe proposition is trying to argue that they will, and that's their like strongest point. That's what they're relying their like entire case on. And then opposition is trying to disprove that. They're really strongly trying to claim that that won't happen. It won't be the case that obesity rates will actually be affected in any way. And so you, as a closing team, can see this battle going on between maybe opening government and opening opposition, and you want to make sure that this kind of clash point is resolved when you give your speech. So you want to think of like lots of different reasons as to why your side of the clash is true. And so if you're able to say three different reasons, then that's quite substantially taking down that clash. The judge is going to be really impressed by that, and it's going to really resolve that clash point. And these kinds of clash points are really important in the debate because they're usually the things which are going to either win or lose you the debate. If you're able to win on that clash point, then that's going to very significantly improve your chances. And finally, you, of course, you want to be doing rebuttal. You listen to the opposition speeches and you want to be thinking of how you're going to respond to them. That's quite straightforward. Okay, once again, any questions? Okay. So here's an example sheet of what this looks like. This is typed out, and of course you can just do the same kind of structure on paper. It's perfectly fine doing it either way. And so you can see here you have your headline at the top. In this case, it's that the longevity of COVID's harms have increased, and the motion is this House believes that UK lockdowns did more harm than good. So after you write down your claim, then you have your subsections underneath. So mental health, national economy, personal and local economy. And you want to be leaving a decent amount of space be, be, below each of these subsections so that you don't have to worry about running out of space, because that can be quite troublesome when you're working on paper and you have more things to write down, but you just don't have the space for it. What ends up happening is maybe you go onto a different piece of paper, but then things just get so messy that during your actual speech, you won't be able to make good use of your notes anymore. They're going to be so messy, they're going to be spread out over multiple pages. A single subpoint isn't going to be in a collective like paragraph, and it's just going to be so difficult to follow that in the pressure of your speech, you just won't be able to handle it. You won't be able to say everything that you thought up of and everything you wanted to say. So in order to like avoid all of those troublesome issues, the best thing to do is just leave a lot of space below each point and below each subpoint so that you won't have that problem. It's better to have extra space left over rather than a like really messy speech because you can't actually read your notes anymore. And so below in this like in this space, you're going to be constantly adding uh, argumentation, analysis, rebuttal, maybe like examples, illustrations, all of the things we've talked about. And as a whole, this is going to be a really strong argument. Finally, you can see there's this ABC structure on the left-hand side. And even if, like, of course, it happens kind of automatically when you're typing things out, but you might want to do something very similar when you are writing stuff on paper as well. Because not only does it structure your thoughts really well, but it makes you sound more concise, more professional, and just smarter in general. So if the judge hears, oh, I've literally heard three separate mechanisms, A, B, and C, as to why COVID's harms are going to be like stretched out over a longer period of time, then that automatically makes them think, okay, this was a really well thought out point, which the speaker spent a lot of thought and time on. So overall, it's going to really help you with your speeches and is going to help the judge understand your speeches. Okay, so that's the first half of the lecture. Any questions before I go on? So that's everything to do with prep time strategies. And I can't like see hands or anything, so just speak up if you do have a question, in case that's the issue. But okay, so moving on to content generation. So this is the main thought process that you want to have when you get basically any kind of motion. So the four sections, there's the problem of what is the key issue the debate is trying to address. Then key clashes, I talked about clashes a while ago. Stakeholders, which are the people who are affected by the motion. And then solvency of basically the other side of the problem, right? You have your problem. How are you going to solve your problem? That's what we're talking about. So onto the problem. So this is basically just the issue which is negatively affecting different groups of people within the debate. So you want to first figure out, is there a problem? In most situations and in most debates, there is, and that should be relatively intuitive of uh, like there wouldn't be any need for policies to be created if there wasn't like some kind of problem we're trying to solve for. Now, next is what is the problem that the motion is trying to solve. So this might just be one problem. There might be multiple problems. And if you're able to identify these problems, that's going to give you your broad umbrellas, like umbrella kind of terms to work under of, okay, this is the main problem. Maybe it's that like small businesses are struggling to grow. That could be the problem, and that would be like an economical problem. And so under that, you can focus everything else, your arguments, and so on. And the tip I have is to be generalizing these problems. So things like social problems, political problems, economical problems. It's good to have your problems be put into these categories because not only does it help in the sense that you can look back on previous debates that you've had, which might have like similar issues, and then you can pull on your experiences from there. It makes it a lot easier to do this when you've categorized it into something like a political problem, but also it's going to help your own thought process in this, like in the debate, even in its like individuality of if you have an economical problem, then you're going to be thinking more about, okay, how do we deal with making sure these small businesses are able to make as much money as possible? So it helps with your thought process. So after your problem, you have your key clashes. These are the disagreements between like proposition and opposition as to how the problem is resolved. So a really good example here is this house would ban gambling. And quite a obvious problem is that people get addicted to gambling, and we don't want that to happen, right? So proposition is going to say that if we ban gambling, then there aren't as many casinos, and so there are fewer people who can just go into a normal casino and get addicted to it. And that seems kind of intuitive. And because since there are fewer opportunities, fewer people are going to get badly addicted to gambling. But then opposition can stand up and contest this point, and this becomes a key clash because they say that gambling, instead of there being fewer places, gambling just moves from this legal sector to a more illegal platform where things are less safe, gambling is less regulated, and if you get addicted, these addictions are just going to be worse. So they can argue that the number of casinos are not going to decrease, they'll just move to a different place. And they can even argue that things are going to get worse because addictions won't be like found out. No one's going to help you with your addictions because now you're doing a crime. You're participating in an illegal activity. So the person who's addicted can't really find help by going to other people since they don't want to admit that they've committed a crime. So these are the kinds of key clashes where both sides are going to really try contesting the best way to solve this problem. Moving on to stakeholders. So these are the people who are affected by the motion. And it really helps to hone in your arguments and make them more specific. So up until now, you've mainly been focusing on broad terms that might apply to lots of different people. But if you focus into a specific group, such as students or teachers or parents, things like that, then you can really get into the intricacies of an argument. And so you want to consider how are these stakeholders affected, how are their incentives changed, uh, and what are their likely reactions. So if you're able to fully think through how are these stakeholders going to act, then you can think of the consequences of the motion and of your arguments and how you're going to benefit these stakeholders. Uh, if the motion was this house would legalize marijuana, then there are three stakeholders. The most obvious one is drug takers. And I think in a lot of cases, debaters might only focus on this singular stakeholder and talk about how they are going to react to marijuana being legalized. But you also need to focus on non-drug takers. How are they going to be affected? Maybe they will begin to take marijuana and get addicted to it, even though before they would have stayed away. And finally, this is probably even harder to think of, but pharmaceutical corporations. So this isn't about individual actors anymore. A pharmaceutical corporation is probably going to be the one who is selling the marijuana. So maybe they're making a lot of money. Maybe you need to talk about how regulated they're going to be, things along those lines. And so imagine if you, at the start of your debate, you just think up of who the stakeholders are, and you get these three actors. That's going to be a huge step in creating content. Because even if you just think up one argument, which applies to drug takers, one about non-drug takers, and one about pharmaceutical corporations, you have three really strong points that don't really overlap with each other. So really varied points, which are going to be really beneficial in your debate. And so this kind of process for thinking up of arguments is, I would really recommend it. It's really good. Um, and yeah, after that, you just think up of how these stakeholders are going to act. Finally, solvency. So how effectively can one side of the house solve a problem? And so the most basic part of this is just proving that the problem you pointed out initially is actually going to be solved due to your arguments, and it's going to be solved on your side of the house. If you can't even solve the problem, then everything that you've done really kind of doesn't amount to much. You need to be able to resolve everything and prove how you are going to be the one who solves this really important problem. But not only do you have to prove that you solve the problem, but you need to prove that the way in which you solve the problem is unique, that it's the only way to get things done, and that any other solution would either not work at all or just be less effective. And so uniqueness is very important because if opposition can also solve the problem, then there's no reason to give proposition the win instead of opposition, right? And then other than uniqueness, you have impacting and weighing. We've talked about these things. It's mainly, sure, maybe now you've solved the problem, but you need to think of the other impacts that come with this and who else is going to be affected, if they're being affected positively or negatively, so on and so forth. And finally, weighing, making sure that the way in which you solve the problem is more effective, kind of like proving it and just doing more of a comparative analysis of your side of the debate and the opposition side, and just showing how you are going to be better off, and like helping more stakeholders, helping them to a greater extent, things like that. Any questions before I go into the last couple of slides?
So ideally, we should be trying to do this in the all of this in the 20 minutes that we have to prepare. I mean,
So yes, you do want to definitely be doing this in your like 15, 20 minutes of prep time, like thinking up of what the debate is revolving around, like the key like problem that needs to be solved. That's definitely something you want to do. Things like stakeholders is definitely something you want to do in your prep time. Key clashes, it's going to be both in prep time, and a lot of it's going to be during the debate as well, when you kind of like see prime minister and leader of opposition giving their speeches, and you see what they're kind of conflicting on, the topics they're conflicting on. And then solvency is just kind of a part of proving that your arguments are effective. So yeah, that comes down in both prep time and outside of prep time. Just kind of making sure your arguments actually work in solving the problem. But yeah, so as you can see, there's a lot of things that need to be done during those 15, 20 minutes of prep time. It's quite difficult to fit that all in, but it's also quite necessary. So, for example, these like things I've just talked about, maybe that's the thought process that you go through during your silent preparation at the start of your prep time during those 2 minutes. Maybe you just think up of the stakeholders and the problem you want to solve, and that could be a good starting point. So, uh, here's just like a example of all of those like four topics. If the motion was this house would make vaccinations mandatory, one of the key problems you might be trying to solve is that people aren't getting vaccinated, that they choose not to get vaccinated, and that it's like really important that they do so, and so you're going to make it mandatory. The key clash is, how do we get the most people vaccinated? Like, is forcing them to get a vaccine really the best way? Or are there other alternatives that might like be, maybe softer, more pleasing to these like anti-vaxxers? And so the opposition is probably going to say that like making things mandatory is just going to maybe make things worse, that there's going to be a lot of backlash, people are going to get angry, and that's maybe not the best way to solve this problem. The actors or the stakeholders are anti-vaxxers, people who do take vaccines, and the government. So there are things you can talk about all of these. Anti-vaxxers, obviously, they're going to be affected here. Even vaccine takers are probably going to be affected in that they interact with these anti-vaxxers on a day-to-day basis. There might be like friends with each other. And so even if you aren't forcing them to take vaccines, they're still going to react to this motion in some way. And then obviously the government is the one who's making this mandatory. So maybe the anti-vaxxers are angry at the government. And then solvency, basically what these kinds of things boil down to is the government is trying to force citizens to do something. And so this is a very politically charged situation. So if you have maybe like a Republican government trying to like force Democrats, or actually realistically it's the other way around, democratic government trying to force Republicans to like take vaccines, then uh, what this is going to come down to is not just the idea of should I take vaccinations or not. It's going to come down to a democratic government is telling me, a Republican, to do something. And so there's going to be some natural kind of resistance to it. And so you want to be able to prove why this resistance exists or doesn't exist based on what side of the motion you're on. And if you're able to like prove that properly, then maybe you can prove that your like vaccinations are actually going to be effective, or like this policy. This is just the last slide, so I'll go through it quickly. So during the debate, so this is not in prep time anymore. This is while other people are speaking. You want to be using your time properly. And the most important thing is having an effective strategy of noting down what other people have said and tracking the the debate. And so you note down what everyone said. You think of the key clashes that you might have thought of in prep time as well, but now you've like solidified them and realized that these are in fact the key clashes. And then you try resolving them. And the best way to do this, in order to make sure you are able to use this time effectively, is leaving extra space under each argument so that you can add stuff, you can edit stuff. Maybe having a completely blank sheet purely for the stuff you're going to do during the debate. That could be maybe a simpler and like easier method. And finally, maybe keeping arguments separate. So possibly using different colored pens for different teams and what they've said so that you don't get confused between what someone else has said and what your response is. You want to make sure everything's really clear on the page. So yeah, that's all. If no one has any questions, we can probably try getting to the debate as soon as possible.